If you've recently graduated or you're in your last year in university or you're just interested in changing your career, then this is the right video for you. Hi there, welcome to the Afro Girl Diaries channel. My name is Belinda. If you haven't subscribed already, please do. This channel is focused on academia, career, and lifestyle content. Today's video is an addition to the career series or work series basically, and it's focused on the pros and cons of applying to a graduate scheme versus an entry-level job. So it would be most beneficial to people who are either recently graduated or you're in your final year of university, and also applicable for people who are looking to change their career. So it's a case where you're starting out in a certain career path. Before diving into the pros and cons of going either route, which is either going for a graduate scheme or going directly into an entry-level job, we need to know what each is. So a graduate scheme, it's a work-based training program. It tends to go for around 12 months all the way to 3 years. I haven't encountered a graduate scheme that's longer than that. And it's usually aimed at graduates to prepare them for a specific role. So the role at the end of the program tends to be a bit more senior, so it's more like a managerial role or an assistant manager type of role. So like the big four, after you finish your graduate scheme, you become an assistant manager. So there's usually a definite role that you're being prepared for in a graduate scheme. For an entry-level job, as it says, you have been hired for a specific job. So you've been hired to perform a specific task. It doesn't mean that you're not trained up, just the training is more informal and it's more to prepare you to start working as soon as possible. So it's not necessarily dedicated towards training you, it's more getting you ready to get started with your daily job. So going on to the pros and cons, I have divided them. I wanted to discuss them through themes. So I have 5 categories that I'm going to cover, basically comparing a graduate scheme and an entry-level job. So the first is the pay. So for graduate schemes, they tend to pay you better. So the starting salary is usually higher than for a typical entry-level job. And that's probably why they're more competitive. It's very competitive to get onto a graduate scheme. So many people apply for them when they're in their final year of uni or when they've just recently graduated. Entry-level jobs, they tend to be run by smaller companies. Large companies also do have graduate jobs or entry-level jobs, but the salary tends to be lower than for a graduate scheme. So that's just facts. In terms of the application process, so graduate schemes, because they're very competitive in terms of the salary, the starting salary, the application process is very rigorous. They tend to involve an online application, at least in the UK. So the experience that I had 3 years ago when I was applying, I had to do an online application. Some are very straightforward. Some require you to give 250 word essays to responses to each question. So it could be one application takes you 15 minutes to complete, another one takes you 2 hours. So they really vary. That's just the first stage. Then you probably have to do online tests, IQ tests, aptitude tests. They're referred to as either of the 3. And for some, it could be a very straightforward test. Others, it's numerical, verbal. Another one for patterns. I can't remember what the specific name for it is, but a lot of tests. Scenario-based tests. Then it could be a telephone interview after that, or a video interview where you have to video yourself and then submit the video. Then it's assessment center, which is usually a whole day activity. For some, it's a 3-day activity, so it's very rigorous. And for others, that's not the end. There's now a second round of interviews after that. So it's a very, very vigorous application process. But for entry level, it's usually more straightforward. It's more a case where you submit a CV and a cover letter, and then you're invited to an interview. So you get to bypass all of that. But again, because entry level tend to be linked to smaller companies, they're not usually advertised in this big recruitment platforms. So you need to search more to be able to find an entry level job compared to grad schemes, which are usually for bigger companies. So they have a bigger marketing budget, I'm assuming. But you will see the advertisements for graduate schemes more for those schemes compared to the entry level jobs. Another thing in the application process, for grad schemes, there's usually a specific application window. So that duration where you can submit your application, and it tends to, in the UK, it's usually between September. They open up in September, which is when you should be entering your final year. And for some of the very big companies, they close by December. So they do it on a rolling basis. When they receive the certain number of applications that they need, they close it off, or they work with a due date. But basically, there's a specific period when you can submit your application, because all of them tend to start at a specific date. So it's usually around July the year after, which coincides with the academic year. So they time when graduates are finishing their final year and graduate, so that you get started after that. For entry-level jobs, because this is a job that you don't necessarily need to have graduated in the most recent year, you can submit your application at any point. Most people submit their application after they're done with their degree. So it could be you graduated now, and then now you submit your application, or you send your CV out to the company, because for entry-level jobs, you can start the job anytime. Most of the time, if they want you, it could be a case where you've done your interview today, next week you're starting your job, or 2 weeks after, because they need to do maybe some background checks, etc. For graduate schemes, it's set starting periods, so you can't really do that. There's not much flexibility with that. Then the third point, the third category is training. So for graduate schemes, they have a specific budget. They have budgeted money for training, because this is a training program. So the training is very structured. Most of the time you get a qualification, a professional qualification. This could be the ACCA if you're doing an audit graduate scheme. If it's a technical graduate scheme, there could be specific certifications that you get as part of that graduate scheme. So simply put, the company sets aside money specific for that training, and they have designed a training program for you. So it's very structured. You don't need to have to submit any form of application just to go with it. It's part of the program. Entry-level job, the training is informal and it's not set. So it's more driven by you and the business need as well. So it could be a case, if you're very driven and you really want to do training, you'd have to talk to your line manager, probably need to submit a business justification. And then hopefully, if they're a good company, they have set aside maybe a budget per person or per team. And basically you'd be able to do the training. But the point is, you might not be able to do that training. It's not guaranteed, because the company hasn't necessarily set that money aside for you to do specific qualifications. But in graduate scheme, it's expected. A downside though for graduate schemes is that training tends to be linked to your contract. So if the company requires you to do the ACCA, for example, this is very common in the Big Four. If you do not pass that ACCA, then you probably lose your job. So it comes with a lot of pressure. It's a good thing you get the professional qualification, but it comes with a lot of pressure in that you'd probably lose your job if you don't get that qualification that they need you to get. Or you wouldn't progress to the next stage, so either way you lose your job. So that's something to consider. Another category is the scope of work. So because graduate schemes tend to be associated with bigger companies tend to have more bureaucracy. So it could be your team focuses on a specific part of the process and has very limited visibility on the other parts that influence or integrate with that process. So you become an expert at that specific thing. This is especially if your scheme is not a rotational based one, because there are some graduate schemes that allow you to work in different teams, and then maybe towards the end you select which team you want to work in. Entry-level jobs tend to be associated with smaller companies. Smaller companies normally translate to smaller teams. So this probably means that your team could be doing a lot more. So if it's a specific process, they're probably doing it end to end in comparison to someone in a bigger company who would only work or focus on a specific part of that process. I hope that makes sense. So in the smaller team, your work is more visible. So there are benefits of being in a smaller team. More visible, probably end up doing a lot more. So more on the job learning with that regard. But also in the big company, if you're really driven and you like a specific part, you can shadow. There are usually secondment opportunities as well. It's just that there's more paperwork involved because formally your team maybe focuses on a specific area. Last point is on career progression. So in a graduate scheme, because it's very structured, the career progression is also more defined. It's clearer for you to see what path, or rather what the next level would be because most of the time it's the graduate scheme, and then at the end of that there's that automatic progression to the next level, which is what they've been preparing you for the whole time. It's not automatic, but it's kind of automatic. What I mean by this is you still need to meet certain criteria, probably training criteria, how you're performing. You need to be performing to a certain standard for you to progress, but it's semi-automatic because you don't necessarily have to put forward like a promotion case for you to get that promotion. It's expected. So unless you don't meet the requirements, then that's when you don't progress to the next stage. But rather, your progression is kind of automatic, at least at the first level, from your graduate scheme to that role. After that, of course, it follows the typical expectation where you have to plead your case and say why, prove why you need to progress to the next stage. Entry-level job is like every other job, where if you want to progress to the next stage, you have to prove your case, which is probably a business case, and prove it also with your performance. That's the end of today's video. I hope that was useful for you. In conclusion, each route is still okay. There may be some benefits in one compared to the other, but the end justifies the means. It doesn't matter which route you take, as long as you're driven, as long as you're hungry for success, you will make it happen irrespective of whether you join the graduate scheme or an entry-level job. So when you're making your applications, don't limit yourself. Of course, focus on the specific type of route you want. So maybe make more graduate scheme applications if you prefer a graduate scheme. But if a good job, you find an advertisement for a good job, don't limit yourself. You'll make it either way. So that's all for today. If you have any suggestions, especially on the job application process, could be interviews, tips on assessment centers, making the technical presentations, any suggestions or queries that you'd like me to cover in my future videos, let me know and I'll do my best to address them. See you later. Bye.